Some people don't argue. They don't scream. They don't beg for closure. They disappear. One day they're replying. The next day, they're gone. Blocked. Unfollowed. Emotionally unreachable. And they call it protecting their peace. But what if cutting everyone off isn't peace? What if it's fear disguised as strength? Today, we're breaking down the dark psychology behind people who cut everyone off. Not to judge them, but to understand what's really happening beneath the silence. On the surface, it looks simple. They get hurt, and instead of working through it, they delete the person from their life. No explanation, no discussion, no repair attempt. Sometimes it looks powerful. They say things like, "I don't tolerate disrespect. I don't chase. People are replaceable. I protect my energy." And sometimes they're right. But when cutting people off becomes a pattern, when every conflict ends in permanent exile, when vulnerability feels impossible, that's when psychology enters the conversation. Because extreme detachment is rarely random. It's usually learned. Many people who cut everyone off develop something called avoidant attachment. At some point in their life, often childhood, they learn something dangerous. Closeness is not safe. Maybe emotions were dismissed. Maybe vulnerability was mocked. Maybe trust was broken repeatedly. So the nervous system adapted. Instead of saying, "I'm hurt," it learned to say, "I'm done." Instead of asking, "Can we fix this?" it learned, "I don't need you anyway." Detachment became armor. And armor feels strong until you realize it also blocks connection. Cutting someone off gives immediate relief. No confrontation. No uncomfortable emotions. No risk of being abandoned. Because if you leave first, you never have to experience being left. And that feels powerful. But it's defensive power. Here's the part most people won't admit. Many people who cut others off are deeply afraid of being abandoned. But instead of clinging, they pre-abandon. They control the ending. If they sense distance, rejection, disrespect, even slightly, they shut the door completely. Why? Because unpredictability feels threatening. When you've been blindsided before, you start scanning for signs. And once your brain detects danger, even if it's small, it activates survival mode. And survival mode doesn't negotiate. It eliminates. Cutting someone off feels like regaining control. But control is not the same as healing. Another layer? Hyper-independence. Some people were forced to emotionally raise themselves. They learned, don't rely on anyone. Handle it alone. Figure it out yourself. So adulthood becomes a self-sufficient fortress. They don't ask for help. They don't explain feelings. They don't tolerate discomfort. Because depending on others once led to disappointment. So now they depend on no one. And when someone gets too close, it feels suffocating. Not because the other person is toxic, but because closeness triggers old survival wiring. Cutting people off becomes a way to regulate anxiety. Distance equals calm. But over time, distance also equals isolation. Now let's balance this. Sometimes cutting someone off is necessary. Abuse, chronic disrespect, manipulation, repeated boundary violations. In those cases, distance is protection. The difference is intention. Healthy boundaries say, I'm stepping back because this is harmful. Unhealed detachment says, I'm stepping back because I'm uncomfortable. One is protection. The other is avoidance. And the two can look identical from the outside. Here's the truth. It's easy to disappear. It's harder to communicate. It's easy to block. It's harder to say, "That hurt me." Real strength isn't cutting everyone off. Real strength is knowing who deserves access to you and having the emotional maturity to express your limits. Sometimes protecting your peace means walking away, but sometimes it means staying long enough to have the difficult conversation. If you've ever cut everyone off, ask yourself honestly, was it clarity or was it fear? Because healing doesn't isolate, it filters. And there's a difference. Have you ever noticed how some people don't argue? They don't explain. They don't fight. They just disappear. No final message. No emotional scene. Just silence. And strangely, they look calm while doing it. But that calm isn't always peace. Sometimes it's protection. Because cutting people off isn't always about anger. Sometimes it's about control. And sometimes it's about fear. When someone makes a habit of removing people from their life, it can look like strength. They say things like, "I don't tolerate nonsense. I protect my energy. I don't chase." And on the surface, that sounds emotionally mature. But here's the uncomfortable truth. There's a difference between healthy boundaries and emotional avoidance. Healthy boundaries require communication. Avoidance requires distance. One builds stability, the other builds isolation. And the problem is, both can look the same from the outside. People who cut others off quickly often operate from something deeper than confidence. They operate from anticipation. They don't wait to see if someone will hurt them. They assume it's coming. So instead of risking rejection, betrayal, or emotional discomfort, they leave first. Psychologically, this is called pre-emptive abandonment. If I walk away first, I can't be left. And that gives a temporary sense of power. But power without connection becomes loneliness. The brain of someone who constantly cuts people off is usually scanning for signs. A delayed reply, a change in tone, less enthusiasm, a shift in attention. Small signals feel like evidence. And once that evidence builds up internally, even without proof, the mind creates a story. They're losing interest. They don't value me. They're about to leave. And instead of asking for reassurance, they withdraw, because asking feels vulnerable. And vulnerability feels unsafe. So distance becomes the safer option. Over time, this pattern creates a self-fulfilling loop. They leave. They feel relief. They tell themselves they made the right choice. But eventually, the silence gets louder. Because every time you cut someone off without resolving conflict, you train your brain to escape instead of engage. And emotional muscles weaken when they're never used. Communication, repair, patience, those require discomfort. Avoidance feels easier. But here's the twist most people don't talk about. Not everyone who cuts people off is toxic. Some are simply overwhelmed. Some grew up in environments where emotions weren't safe, where expressing hurt led to dismissal, where asking for reassurance led to shame, where closeness led to instability. So their nervous system learned something powerful. Distance equals safety. And once that belief settles deep enough, it doesn't matter how healthy the other person is. The threat feels real. Real emotional strength isn't about how quickly you can remove someone. It's about how calmly you can stay. Can you express discomfort without attacking? Can you say, "That hurt me," instead of disappearing? Can you tolerate uncertainty without assuming the worst? That's maturity. Because sometimes cutting someone off is necessary. But if it becomes your first response instead of your last resort, it might not be empowerment. It might be avoidance dressed as strength. The hardest part of growth isn't setting boundaries. It's learning when you're building walls instead. And walls feel safe until you realize you're the only one inside them.